Okay, everybody, welcome to the first ever late night show, the Tamayo Creative Late Night Show. This is the very first podcast we got putting together. Today, we got Vince Georgescu on the podcast with us. You guys met him in a couple of videos a little while back. He's kind of our camera guy, the tech nerd behind how exactly we use that. He's actually taught me a lot on exactly how to make the videos look really good with my camera. So, Vince, welcome, and thanks for doing this.
It's good to be here, finally. Nonetheless, we made it, and we're see what we can get into.
Yeah, man, no, it's going to be really exciting. So I think the first thing that we want to talk about is some of your experience with a camera. How long have you been taking photos?
Gosh. Seriously taking photos has probably been since like 2008.
Mm-hmm.
I made a pivot when I was in high school from drawing to photography because I really liked working with black and white or graphite medium, and wanted to create a bank of some of my own images so that one day if I ever got back into drawing, I'd have a collection of black and white images to pull from. And so I took a couple years of darkroom, 2 years, and black and white photography, learned how to shoot film, learned techniques, learned vision, learned whatever, pretty standard stuff that they cover in those years of formal film education. So took a lot away with it, and I still shoot today. I never stop. That's the big difference is even though I am no longer in high school, I have continued to shoot film continuously ever since then.
So you shoot mainly in film, not really like just mirrorless cameras or...
Correct. No, I've never aside from cell phones.
Yeah.
Most of us keep in our pockets, are incredibly convenient for photography. However, there is still a very artistic aspect of having manual control over every aspect of what you are aiming to capture when you shoot film with a SLR, a single lens reflex is what SLR stands for, camera. Okay. Not DSLR, not digital single lens reflex.
Oh, just SLR.
Just a single lens reflex. A mechanical camera.
Learn something new every single day.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So like in your opinion then, so we have known that, and this is just a sidebar question. We know that cameras in cell phones have really come a long way. Mm-hmm. Can you see any of the techniques that you've put into your photography eventually reaching cell phones and portable devices with photography?
One of, at least that comes to mind, yes, there's no doubt that the capability of cell phone cameras has changed and grown exponentially in our lifetime. So that's impressive, number one, just from what they're able to do. But as cell phone cameras increase their capabilities, more and more people pay attention to minute aspects of different camera capabilities. And if this is where, if the lead into what, a hot topic for me that kind of fires me up, but then maybe this could be that segue.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, no, there's a lot of aspects, and you can see even just from the software, the interface of a lot of mobile devices, cell phone cameras, providing more manual controls to the users. This depends on the camera, the phone itself,
yeah,
and how much control you would have over certain aspects of aperture and shutter speed and ISO and things like that. So
yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit. You said aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Can you just like briefly define those three things for people who, like me at the beginning, had no idea what those things were?
Yeah. So a lot of this terminology originates back with the mechanical single lens reflex cameras. These were made extensively through, from up until digital cameras started coming around in like the late 90s, 2000s. Yeah. All cameras prior to that had to mechanically operate, eventually, with some batteries and things like that. But the terminology, aperture, which is interchanged with f-stop, and I'll explain why, as well as shutter speed and ISO. Their origins lie from the mechanical era. So aperture is essentially, and this is the most confusing for people typically to wrap their minds around. Right. Aperture is the size of the opening that is within the lens that dictates how much light passes through that opening to hit the film. Okay. So if we think about mechanical cameras, there's film, 35 mil or whatever kind of film you're shooting within the camera. And the objective of the lens is to dictate and influence how much or how little light passes through so that it hits the film. Okay. So a really small opening, which is represented by and this is a lot of things in photography are in opposites. So a small opening is represented by a large number, a large f-stop or a large aperture number. So a really small opening could be something like f22. Okay, is a common one. So a high f-stop represents a really small opening, lets a very little amount of light in. But what information comes through that small opening and hits the film, it's all going to be in focus.
Okay.
This is the opposite of a large opening. Is going to allow more light in through the lens to hit the film. And that is represented, the large opening is represented by a small number. So f2.0, f1.8. And that value is going to allow what you're focused on be in focus.
Okay, so if, like, for an example, like the iPhone, for example,
yeah,
a lot of them have like f1.2/f1.4.
Like you take a picture and it'll tell you that it was captured at this f-stop.
Yeah, and like that's kind of like the default setting for something like that. So does that mean that they're letting a lot more light in? So like the better the lighting is for like something of an iPhone or a Google Pixel or whatever would be better with a lower f-stop, or does it kind of vary by case?
It depends on the environment.
And kind of what you're going for.
Right. So a low light environment, you're going to want a large f-stop to let as much light in as possible. There are other ways that you can achieve a balanced image by controlling aspects besides just the f-stop.
Yeah.
For example, well, to answer your question though, the small, I'm less familiar of the details of the cameras that are built into our cell phones.
Right.
But in theory, a large opening, so a small f-stop, will let in more light and produce a different image than a higher f value, a higher aperture value.
Okay, sweet. Mm-hmm. No, that's good to know. I know always anytime they release something like that.
Like portrait modes are typically or something like low lighting or something where you really just want to focus on one person or one subject. That'll probably be at a lower, like an f1 point something or an f2 point something.
Right.
value.
Yeah.
Versus a landscape maybe at a higher f-stop.
Yeah, that would make sense. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Because I was talking about like the iPhone versus like the Canon that I'm using right here in the last video.
Yeah.
And one thing that, and I feel like this could be the topic of our discussion, but one thing that I was talking about was how with a larger lens and a larger body, and I apologize, we can get back to the other definitions of the other stuff because there's more questions I want to ask you about that. Totally. But I was talking about how larger cameras have something that's called, or that you can control, called bokeh, a little bit better than something like an iPhone can have, right? And you sent me an article that was like, hey man, bokeh is a little bit different than what a lot of people think it is. So can you just explain to me like what bokeh actually is versus what a lot of people think bokeh actually is, and your discrepancy between the two?
So this bokeh is a term that was not really on my radar until people began discussing it relative to cell phone capabilities. Yeah. Bokeh, as most people may know it, refers to maybe the blurred aspect of an image. or part of an image that may not intentionally be in focus, but is still within the image.
Right.
And as technology advances, hardware, software aspects of cameras, of cell phone cameras, that bokeh term has seemed to be such a hot topic that people refer to. I was like, dang, this camera is so good. Look at the bokeh that it can produce in this picture.
Yeah.
And so I comprehend with what they're saying, but to me, the way I was trained in photography is not to focus on the bokeh. So it's almost like a positive space and negative space aspect. What I don't use the term bokeh. There are aspects and situations where it is totally appropriate to refer to, but instead, I believe it's better as a photographer or as a person who's discussing this topic, this concept, to refer to the depth of field of an image.
So you think those terms have been incorrectly interchangeable for the past 5 years, ever since iPhone came out with its portrait mode and the bokeh around the subject and stuff like that?
Well, in terms of a portrait mode, the bokeh around a subject, in this case, in a portrait mode, I'm taking a picture of you.
Right.
I want you to be in focus so the camera can accomplish that. The aspect of almost artificially blurring everything around you, that's the bokeh.
Okay.
So that's an aspect of, there's probably a software component of the phone that's artificially making that happen.
Right.
If I were to take a picture with, any other camera besides a more manual camera, and have manual control over the lens, the body, the aperture, shutter speed is another thing we haven't talked about, but we can cover that later.
Of course.
If I was going to take a picture of you, a portrait with my own 50 millimeter single SLR camera, film camera, I don't have that artificial capability to blur the background.
Right.
Artificially, I can do it. I can achieve a similar result through different strategies and different approaches.
But different focuses with a lens.
It comes down to the lens. It is a huge feature to provide that control, as well as knowing how to control and adjust the aperture of the lens. Again, dictating how much light makes it through, dictating how much, as well as the focus of what's within the frame is in focus. And those are two big ones. There's certainly more, but if we just focus on those to keep it simple, I could put myself closer to you or farther away to get different effects as well. But depth of field is what I want to go back to. This is what I'm trying to focus on.
Right.
I focus on what I want to focus on. And so I will focus on you, and I will make sure that you are exactly how I want you to look. But in this case of, if I'm trying to take a portrait of a person, not using a cell phone with a portrait mode, but with my own camera, if you have any type of manual camera or some kind of camera where you can control the aperture, then I'll just make sure I'm physically where I am to want to have you framed within the image as I do. And then I'm going to select a low f-stop. So a small f-stop number, something like 2.0, 1 point, however low you can get it, and focus on you. And by doing that combination of just focusing on you and bringing the f-stop as low as I can possible for the given natural lighting condition, that will create a shallow depth of field. A shallow depth of field means that what I'm focusing on is the only thing that's focused on.
In focus, yeah.
Correct. So in that case, a natural blur, or in this case, we could use bokeh, will, result in everything that I'm not focused on.
Okay, yeah.
Because I chose to focus on you because I'm taking a portrait with my manually controlled device. So yeah, that is an example of a shallow depth of field, meaning I'm focusing on what I want to, that's it. And everything that I'm not intentionally focusing on, everything in the background behind you, I don't care about.
Yeah.
I don't want that in the image. It's distracting. I want to focus on you.
Sweet. And I know that you said that you had brought some examples of some stuff like this
Yeah.
in your photography history that we can kind of take a look at here.
No, one example, and you're correct, Mike, that this is a photo that I took years ago. Nonetheless, that's the beauty of photography, is it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
These are all archived. But I was in Athens, Greece, actually up at the Parthenon.
Oh, wow.
And was walking past, there's a wall up top, and saw a hole in the wall that probably most people would have just passed by. However, at that point in time, I was like, oh, I wonder, like, if I went and looked through that, what that would look like. Like, can I see the city? What's behind it?
Yeah.
And ended up deciding I was carrying my film camera with me, this guy right behind me, and thought this could be really interesting. So what I did was I took a series of photographs, a pair of photographs. The first shot, I focused on the hole immediately in front of me. This is an example of a shallow depth of field.
Okay.
So there's this cutout in the wall.
Oh, wow.
And you can see all the texture, lining all the surfaces that's most immediately in front of you. Consider this like a portrait. I'm focusing on exactly what I want to focus on, and anything else that I'm not focused on, I don't care about. It's going to be blurred.
I love that, dude. It's funny. It's almost like reversed portrait mode because, in portrait mode, you have the centerpiece focus and everything else around it's blurred. I'm curious as to see if like something like an iPhone or a Pixel or whatever could even come close to catching that, since it's almost reversed.
That's a good question, actually.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll have to make a trip again. But what's interesting is I tried to keep my position as still as possible. And all I did, so I changed two things for this next shot. For this first shot that we're looking at right now, I'm focused on the hole itself, the cutout in the wall.
Right.
And to accomplish this, I have a shallow depth of field, so a low f-stop number. And I set the shutter speed to balance out the light meter, in this case, because I'm shooting film. I don't care about the shutter speed. Shutter speed doesn't matter. I just need the appropriate amount of light exposure to hit the film.
Right.
So what I changed next is, instead of focusing on what's immediately in front of me, I focus on everything in the distance. I focus on infinity. I want as much depth. I want a high depth of field in this case to be present. And I focus on the city and everything that's through this hole, because again, at this case, I don't care about the hole itself.
Right.
I already got the cutout. And the resultant image is, you can see everything in the city looking out through this hole in the wall. And again, a high depth of field. In this case, because there is a subject in the foreground, this wall still, the wall is blurred.
And what was that?
The term that could be applied to the wall in this photo is bokeh.
Is bokeh, okay.
Yes. But again, my focus was not the bokeh. My focus was the depth of field. I wanted a shallow depth of field in the first shot, and then I wanted a high depth of field in the second shot.
And that's all by changing your f-stop.
Correct. In this case, I changed my f-stop and maybe a little bit the shutter speed. But what's cool about the shutter speed is, again, film cameras, if we put the thinking cap on for film cameras, there's a chemical reaction when light hits the film that when light hits an area of the film, that turns into a dark spot.
Yeah.
So that when you put that, and then you have a negative. And when you look at film negatives, they're called negatives because they're backwards. So that when you put them under an enlarger and you shine light through the negative, it actually turns out how you saw it originally. It's a very backwards process to photography.
That's some Red Room stuff.
Totally. No, you're exactly right. So, and I only bring this up as an example of shutter speed because I did change my f-stop. I went from a very large opening in the very first photo. So I'm letting a lot of light in, and I have a shallow depth of field focusing on what's immediately in front of me. So to make that happen, I probably had a pretty quick shutter speed.
Right.
Since I'm letting in a little bit, have a wider opening, I want still a balanced amount of light to hit it. So probably had a slightly quicker shutter speed.
For sure.
And then for the next shot, because I have a very small opening, lots is in focus, far out in the horizon, high depth of field. Because that opening's so small, I probably need a little bit more time to let the light hit the film. So that this shutter speed in the second image is probably slower.
Okay. Because you
to have a similar total exposure on the film. So you play with the two.
Man, that's something that
F-stop, shutter speed. What are we trying to accomplish? How much light's going to hit the film, and what are we focused on? How are we manually focusing? Not touching the screen, but how are we manually focusing the lens itself?
That's beautiful. You know what's funny is I think this is a lost art, because as somebody who's been doing this for a while, you sound like you could explain this to almost anybody. And in somebody in like my case, or probably the majority of people's cases, everyone just uses their cell phone.
Totally.
Right. And
which is great.
Yeah.
Because it provides us the ability to document so much more frequently and easily than carrying around a physical hammer of a camera made of metal. But at the same time, this is why I enjoy continuing to shoot film, is the intention that at least I put behind each exposure.
Yeah.
And there is a finite amount of film in the camera. So if you're out walking around shooting whatever over the course of a day, you don't have an unlimited number of images.
Right.
And especially because you have to pay for a roll of film. It's anywhere from a couple bucks to like $10-15 for a roll. You don't want to just burn through it willy-nilly all the time.
Yeah.
So
you want them to be good.
There's a lot of intention behind each exposure. This is how I approach my photography with film. And it's thinking about how I want the image to turn out before I take the picture, and having that vision of what am I trying to accomplish here.
Right.
That's why I think of an image in terms of depth of field. What am I focusing on? What am I trying to accomplish? Instead of what am I trying to blur?
Yeah.
So when I hear bokeh used so abundantly, it just gives me the impression that some people, and this isn't everybody, but like some people are not focusing on the right aspect of capturing.
No pun intended.
What's that?
No pun intended.
No pun intended. I mean, and this is there are exceptions to everything.
Right.
So like again, I'll go back to portrait mode. Cool piece of software, intentionally bokeh is the background.
Right.
Different case than, I'm approaching my photography, and even the way I think about shooting, capturing images on my phone, I still think about it the same way as if I'm shooting film. With what am I focusing on? What am I trying to accomplish? Not what am I trying to blur.
I like that. The only way I can really relate to that is like when I'm creating these videos.
Yeah.
What am I trying to accomplish? I can kind of see it going into it, so I know how to maybe mess with lighting, mess with angles, mess with all that kind of stuff. I think that's awesome, man. I think that's awesome. Well, I know that we're getting close on time.
Yeah.
But I know there's some things that we didn't get to cover, like what is it, aperture, shutter speed. Well, you kind of touched on shutter speed, but we can definitely do that
briefly.
Again. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot more to discuss when it comes to all these aspects,
right?
And how they can influence the end product of an image.
Awesome. Well, I mean, dude, let's go through that next time. Guys, thanks so much for checking out the very first Tamaya Creative Late Night Show. Thank you, Vince, for coming and giving us an education on exactly what we're doing here, because I bought this camera to make things look good, and I didn't even know how to do it until I got to sit down and chat with you about it.
No, happy to be here. Fun talking shop, always good. And also, for anyone who's interested, if you like the images that we discussed in today's episode, they can also be found on the website, which is
TamayoCreative.com.
Bingo. Thanks, guys.
See ya.